being on the board, keeping it simple. Welcome to the Better Boards podcast series, the podcast for chairs, CEOs, non-executive directors, company secretaries and their advisors. Every episode is filled with practical insights and learnings from those inside boardrooms. We discuss what really matters and highlight actionable steps you can take to enhance the performance of your board. This episode helps you to understand how you can keep things simple. Sounds simple, doesn't it? But in a complex world, it isn't. And what my guest really spells out is how you can focus on a few critical elements. And these are the elements that help you to be really impactful in the boardroom and contribute to a highly effective board. I'm absolutely delighted to talk again with Sir John Tusa. Sir John is known to the British public as a main presenter of BBC Two's Newsnight programme. He was a managing director of some of the most iconic media and cultural centres in the United Kingdom, like BBC World Service, City of London's Barbican Arts Centre, etc. He chaired the boards of cultural institutions. Sir John, thank you so much for returning and being once again a great contributor to the Better Boards podcast series.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be with you, Sabine.
Our listeners love your contribution, which is fantastic. Now today, as people could see, we have quite a catchy title, Being on the Board, Keeping It Simple. Now we live in a very complex world and things are becoming more and more troublesome, challenging. In preparation for the podcast, we discussed something that really struck me. I mean, you said being on the board is difficult, but not complicated. What do you mean by that?
I think what I mean by that is that there are, of course, important matters that you have to consider when you join a board. For example, the whole business of the legal basis of the organization and the board's responsibilities, the expectations of the Charity Commission as to how a member of a board behaves. There may well be other aspects of regulation that you have to think about. There may be shareholder responsibilities that you have to take into account. If it's not one where there are shareholders, there will be stakeholders who you have to consider. And if that is all that you do, and that is a lot, and that is important, and it all has to be taken into account, that you might say is the complicated bit. But my strong feeling is that if that is all that you do, the board is probably not doing its job, and that you, as a board member, are probably not doing your job. Those are the complicated things, but the things that really make a difference are what I call the simple ones, which I can tell you about. What I've said just now is the basis. You start with that, but then the really interesting and important stuff comes afterwards.
And you call it the simple stuff. Explain a bit more.
Well, think of why you are on a board. Think of why you are interested in an organization. Because it seems to me that what you bring to a board, or should bring to a board, is of course your skills. And they may be particular skills which are relevant to an organization or to the functioning of the board. You certainly bring your knowledge, the knowledge that you have accumulated over many years, no doubt, in other areas of activity. You certainly bring your experience also, which you have developed and which is very, very precious. The situations that you face when you come to a new board, they're very unlikely to be different from the situations that you have faced in the past. So you can use your experience in these new circumstances. What's also terribly important is your own commitment, the commitment of time. That is actually quite simple. Now, it may not be altogether simple to organize your life, but people should never be surprised by the fact that if an organization is working well, and if a board is working well, you may well want to give it more time than you were originally told it would take. Now, all those things, you have your skills, you have your experience, you have your commitment, and you have your time. Those are the simple things. They are, let's call them the simple gifts that you bring to being a board member. And those really are the important ones that you overlay over the technical ones. That's why I say that it is simple. You have all those things, use them for the benefit of the organization and the board.
Let me zoom on something you said, because I very often get the question, very often in advertisements for a board post, or when I spoke with headhunters, they say, typically we count with a commitment of 20 days per annum for a board. Now, speaking with board members, particularly in times like these, they very often told me this is complete nonsense. It is more like 40, sometimes 50 days per annum. What's your experience in this?
Well, when I first started getting involved in boards, I was told, and I remember I was invited onto the board of English National Opera, no less, and the chairman, a very distinguished musician, Lord Harwood, said, "It won't take up too much time. 4 board meetings, 1 away day, and possibly 1 other. That should not be too onerous." Well, that was 25 years ago, and we've moved on a lot since then. Now, whether it takes 30 or 40 days, my feeling about time is that if the organization's worthwhile, and if you're interested in it, you probably give it the time that it needs. But certainly, headhunters or anybody else inviting you onto a board should not underestimate how long the time you might want to give to it is. And what I do say is that the more generous you can be with your time, the better it is for the organization and the better it is for you as a board member. It is a worthwhile activity, and incidentally, you learn a lot from being on other organizations' boards, and the more time you have, and the more commitment you can give, the more you personally benefit from it, as well as being able to contribute.
No, it was an important point, because I very often get the question, from directors, but also headhunters who sometimes wonder, gosh, how shall we pitch it really? There was one other thing that really struck me in our conversation is there's so much emphasis on talk about AI, but you very much stress the human side of the work on the board. We discussed technical and human skills, and I found it quite interesting how much you really stress these human skills. And it is almost something, either we take it for granted or it's almost forgotten in all these discussions about technology, board packs, digital platforms, AI in the boardroom, etc. So let's really focus a little bit on what you mean by this, the human side of the work, and how can directors really hone those skills?
I think the first skill is, how well do you know your fellow members on the board? They don't have to be your best friends forever. Some of them may never be your best friends. That's not the point. You should know enough about them. You should certainly know enough about the chair. You should certainly know enough about the chief executive and the executive team. Those are, as seems to me, to be absolutely human essentials. Because if you don't know the board, if you don't know the chair, then how can you actually operate as a human being? By the way, when I hear the word board pack, I almost want to reach for my bonfire. One of the standard tricks of organizations which don't work, and I have certainly been at more than one, is where the executive says, well, we don't really want the non-execs interfering, so we'll give them so much paper that they will never get round, A, to reading it, and B, to being able to question it. So the board pack needs to be slim. I've been on at least 2 organizations where we just said to the executives, you are not giving us several hundred pages. Give us what we need to know to take decisions and to give the advice. So you must not be snowed under by paper. And under those circumstances, it then becomes much clearer about how and what you can contribute. But you can't contribute if you're absolutely covered by a deluge of paper. And by the by, no organization which exists with screeds of paper and thinks that so long as you sign those board packs off, you have done your job. The board hasn't done its job, is not doing its job, and actually the executive is preventing it from doing its job. One has to step back and say, how can we help? And the answer to that is, you can help by being effective, and you can only be effective if you're not snowed under with paper. Does that take us forward a bit?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, I can't agree more. And you know what's surprising? There are so many people who have done a good job in developing tools, in developing tech solutions. There's so much training out there, and yet the papers, in every board evaluation, it is a topic. They are still too large. I seldom see an organization with less than 250 pages of paperwork before a board meeting. I still see very often board packs of 400, 500 pages.
Absolutely ludicrous. And it's up to the chair to say to the executive, we cannot work like this. I had to say that in the court of the University of the Arts London. I was completely at one with the Vice-Chancellor, and we said to the executives who were preparing these papers, the governors cannot say anything sensible faced with all these papers. And what's more, I, as chair of the Court of Governors, I simply couldn't invite outsiders onto the court if I knew that they were going to be swamped with papers which actually prevented them from doing anything interesting. So if there are too many papers, like many things, this needs to be sorted out by the chair and the chief executive. This is also what I come down to calling good behavior and common sense. Nobody can take in that amount of paper. Nobody can take decisions. You can take decisions if the major questions are raised, and then people may have something sensible or useful to say. They may not, but they certainly can't have anything useful to say when they're faced with hundreds of pages, which, by the way, waste an enormous amount of executive time and are almost guaranteed to prevent people from being able to take decisions. At the University of the Arts, we were doing a review of risk analysis, and the center of the university had its pages of risk analysis, and each college, and there were 6 constituent colleges of the University of the Arts, they had their risk analysis, and the departments had their risk analysis, and it came to hundreds of risks. And I had a wonderful chair of the audit committee who just said, this is nonsense. You can't work like this. I want no more than a dozen or more absolute salient risks. So I'm throwing all this out. And by the by, he said, I also want a register of opportunities. So that is, boards can be really effective in shaping how an institution behaves, because nobody should waste their time dreaming up pages of risks which actually are not risks.
Let's come back to our original question. We sidetracked a bit here with the papers, but it's such an important point that continues to come up. We were talking about the importance of the human side of the work on the board. So what are the skills? What should board members do? What should they hone? What should they invest their time in? Because you mentioned the importance of that people really know each other. And I'm saying this very often to the boards we work with. You know, I can remember the noughties. I was in consultancy at the time. And I was telling at a conference, actually, on a Friday, almost everyone was tipsy in the office. Now, today, unthinkable. Of course, don't do this. Don't do this these days in the year 2024, But we knew each other. You know, we had times together in the pubs. We had times together at meals. We really, really knew each other. The same at board level. People had elaborated lunches, elaborated dinners. Now, not all was perfect. Governance was not necessarily perfect, but people knew each other. Today, they spend less and less quality time together. So this bit of knowing who your fellow directors are is really suffering.
Oh, yes. Let me put it down to this. And by the way, if you don't know your fellow board members, you probably don't know the executive well enough either. But I think what is going seriously wrong, and I risk a generalization, is that this plethora of paper and so on, it's all done in the name of accountability. And accountability means that you are asking somebody else, somebody outside, to check what you are doing. I prefer responsibility. And the difference is this. If you accept responsibility, it means if something goes wrong, you pay the price, whatever it may be. But you say, we took this decision for the following reasons. If it went wrong, then certain consequences follow. Accountability means so long as we have ticked the boxes, nobody is going to criticize us. And that's, I think, why we are where we are. And it wastes time, and it prevents people from saying, this is a difficult decision. For example, we know that it is risky, but we're going to do it. I'll give you one example. Again, at the University of the Arts London, we were faced with an upward of £40 million investment problem opportunity to redevelop an entirely new college, Central St. Martin's. It was absolutely borderline, but we knew we had to do it, and we did it knowingly, and we signed the contracts 6 days after the banking crash, and the board took responsibility. It was a brilliant success. We would have been advised not to do it, but the board looked at the numbers, used all their expertise, and did it. That's being responsible. And I think the most important thing is for the board and the chair to say, we're responsible. We can tick the boxes. Frankly, any fool can tick the boxes. We're not going to do that. We're going to do better than that. We'll go beyond the boxes into the world of judgment, risk, sensible risk-taking, and facing responsibility. And that, in a strange sort of way, is also, I think, much more simple than all the network of accountability and board papers. That's why I say that being on a board is, or ought to be, simple, or keep it simple. And that's how you keep it simple.
I mean, now people who read this and who listen to us will say, but how? But how do I do this? How do I get there?
You have to stand up and say, I can't take all these papers. I can't take all these numbers. I cannot offer an opinion or a view about the organization on the basis of the information that is being given to me. Because in the end, I mean, I've always said, there are no stupid questions on a board. No. And equally, if a board member thinks that they cannot do their job because of the weight of paper and other considerations being thrown at them, if they don't speak up, then they have only themselves to blame. There's no point in sitting on a board and saying, well, I don't feel I can contribute anything because I'm not being given the information that I need. If you're not being given the information that you need, well, you've got a voice, stand up. No, there are no stupid questions, and there are no stupid opinions. And also, the moment you think that people are throwing information at you in order to prevent you from doing your job as a board member, if you don't speak up, then what's the point?
We say so often, I lost count on how many panels I sat on or listened to, and it always comes up, we have to speak up, we have to ask challenging questions. Now, the interesting thing is when I have these one-on-one interviews as part of the board evaluations, people tell me what they think, what they are feeling. And then I ask them, have you discussed this with anyone? Because very often they have the right hinge. They have the right sense of something isn't entirely right, but they're not speaking about it. What makes it so difficult to speak up, and how can people overcome that fear of speaking up? What would help them to do so?
I think it may be because they don't want to fall into the trap of saying we are the board and we know better than the executive, and therefore we're telling the executive what to do. You're not telling the executive what to do, or you shouldn't be. What you are doing is making observations and, at best, inviting the executive to think about questions either which they haven't thought about or are reluctant to think about. And if you approach it from that point of view, there's a whole area of common sense activity. Again, this is why I say that the activity is simple. It's common sense activity, which might say, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? And either there's a good answer from the executive or there isn't. And it's as if, and I recognize the feeling that the people you speak to say, I really do. You're sitting on a board. It's as if life is different. It's as if you are different. And that is why I say it's not. It's about how you behave, how the board behaves, how the executive behaves, and try as much as possible to behave on the board in a way that is like the way that you would behave in everyday life.
Oh, that sounds like sound good advice here. But sadly, Sir John, we have to come to an end to it. I'm looking at the clock. And as you know, we always ask at the end, what are the 3 things our listeners should take away from this podcast?
Well, I would say you have the right to ask questions and to offer opinions about any subject before the board. It's not only the finance board member, because there'll always be one, an accountant, who's allowed or expected to put questions about finance. Anybody can and should. You should spot concealment or evasion. And always remember that if you don't ask those questions and a problem gets hidden, the problem hidden is always going to blow up. And when it blows up, it is much, much worse than if you had asked the question. So the price for not speaking up is the possibility of a much worse crisis later on. So row back and say, why are we doing all these things? And are we doing the things on the board that really contribute and where I can contribute? And if you're absolutely covered with paper and sometimes with deliberate evasion, you can't do your job. And sometimes you may have to say, there's no point in sitting on this board because I'm not able to do my job. That's why I say, keep it simple.
Thank you so much, Sir John. Thank you so much for contributing to the Better Boards podcast series.
Great pleasure, Sabine, always.
Thank you for listening. If you are interested in contributing to the Better Boards podcast series, or if you have ideas about a topic you would like us to cover, please do get in touch. Also, if you're interested in our wider work or join about our growing community, get in touch. Our main work centers around conducting effective board evaluations. We have an innovative platforms our clients and our members of the communities are using for the internal evaluations and as part of the external evaluations. If you would like to see a demo, if you would like to speak to other members of our community, again, reach out, get in touch. We are always delighted to hear from you. You can best reach us at info@better-boards.com. Thank you.